this part of the talk and share my screen. Just making sure that you can see it. Yes, okay, cool. So here we go. Kick us off, a little background on why we exist. Mandala exists because, honestly, because of the effects of systemic racism and the fact that they're finally being verbalized and quantified in the American workplace. This is, to be clear, this has been a problem since 1619, and it's been a problem for hundreds of years. Most of the time, this problem has never been documented or measured or understood. But in the last, honestly, 1 to 2 years, we started realizing that there are real effects to systemic racism on people of color as they walk into the working world, or as they walk into life in general. We're seeing the effects of traumatic incidents related to George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd, but also the effects of the Asian hate misinformation that evolved as a result of the pandemic, and how that's impacted our Asian siblings. Now, as we think a little bit about the costs of this, there are quantifiable now metrics around the costs of race-related attrition, absenteeism, and productivity loss, which are very capitalistic ways of capturing the value of a human being. But in a strange way, it gives the language to actually make a persuasive case to even the least attentive of CFOs that actually there's a problem and there's something that you need to do to solve it. And what we've heard today is a number of kind of suggestions of what those answers could be. And for a long time, employers started off by making the case that, well, maybe if we provided therapy, the solution would manifest. People would feel better, they'd walk into the workplace with more energy and with more resilience. And there's a truth to that. Therapy does provide that for a significant amount of people. But when we look at the data on who actually uses these therapy platforms, by and large, they're not people of color. In fact, people of color are about half as likely to use mental health services, even when they're provided for free. And that's largely because the network of therapists in this country is so undiverse. Out of a country that's around 40% BIPOC, only 17% are people of color and in the provider network. And not to mention, there's generations of stigma that make people question whether or not therapy is even for them. And in fact, most of the times, the dialogue that you don't hear surfacing, but is always happening in households, is this is white people stuff. It's actually not for everyone. It's not for us. There's not that many people in our family that have ever even gone. How could you be so audacious to think that it would be working for you? And so there's reason to believe that something beyond therapy could really help the people of color that we're in community with. And that answer cannot just be the competing priorities or the ERGs or the nature of work that actually floods in to the ecosystem. And so when we think about ERGs, employee resource groups, that's one of the solutions that companies generally advance. But also people in the workplace have 100 other things that they've got to focus on, whether it's their actual day-to-day, whether it's their situations in the workplace, whatever it is. There's so much that's consuming the attention and mind space of employees of color that actually they don't necessarily have that space, which is what leads us to Mandala. What's really missing is an opportunity to provide belonging and well-being for BIPOC. And that's really what we've been building. At our core, what Mandala offers is what we call resilience circles, where a group of people of color come together, and over the course of several weeks, they talk about the deepest, most enriching parts of their lives that maybe they haven't actually had a chance to surface. We go through psychoeducation, we go through a very light amount of mental health education. We do it through the context of people helping people in a community, because our thesis is that the world needs more community, and that community could actually really help people. And imagine if that community could come from the workplace that you're a part of, with a group of people that are dedicated to the same values and norms that you've signed up for, and also to the same practice of growth and development that you're looking to orient yourself around. The second part of what we do is actually provide that community throughout the year in the form of meditation, journaling, reflective writing, conversations with people in the space who might offer some expertise and some advice. And so that's, in a nutshell, what it is that we do. To give you a sense of what our curriculum looks like, so what is it that we actually cover in these sessions, it really ranges. It ranges from mindfulness, which is really where it starts, into a conversation around your identity, which Dr. Harrison will touch on in terms of intersectionality and the ranges of different classifications of identity, into inner child work, so really thinking about our early childhood experiences and how those affect how we show up in the world, followed by the inner critic, because oftentimes the things that we don't get from our childhood show up in the form of a critic that's constantly telling us that we're not enough, that there's other people out there that are better than us, or there's a self-worth issue that tends to manifest. And so we really tap into what it means to be in a good, healthy relationship with that inner critic, because certainly it has a role to play, but what's that role that it's playing in your life? Which leads into stress and resilience. Stress is really about the ways in which the modern workplace actually do cause a lot of stress for us, and what it is that we can do to actually engage with that stress and figure out both mechanisms to respond to it, but also the kind of community we need to actually combat burnout. And the final session, which is my personal favorite, is really around resilience, which is how do you come up with a plan for what it means to feel empowered in your life? Quite literally, we have people cut out a piece of their curriculum. We have a workbook that we mail to people, and we ask them to put it on their fridge, because when you know what you really need from your own life based on your experiences and the things we've taught, then you're able to make that difference in your own life. And so that experience of knowing what you need in community with other people really can dramatically transform the impact of people's experiences with themselves and their well-being. So quick thing on AMSA, then I'll pass it over to Leighna. We partnered with the American Medical Students Association earlier in the month. And the American Medical Students Association is a conglomerate of a bunch of medical students that are in their first, second, third year. And if you have any friends in the medical world, or you know what their lives have been like, especially the last few years, you know that it's not exactly a space of thriving and well-being. There's a lot of burnout. There's a lot of grinding self-doubt. There's a lot of anxiety that manifests in their workplaces, that's compounded by the structure of their workplaces. And what we got a chance to do is we got a chance to work with 8 of them and go through some of the exercise I've shared with you. And I've put some of the qualitative quotes that came out of our conversations with them, what people actually got out of being in community with each other, and some of the data that's actually come out of these sessions. So you'll see on the right, there's been some meaningful improvement on things like psychological safety, on the extent to which people feel emotionally exhausted. And my favorite metric, the empowerment people have to take care of their own well-being, the language, the tools, the frameworks that they can start to employ to actually make their lives more meaningful, more enriching, and hopefully healthier. And then finally, a space to actually say, you know what, I never thought that exploring therapy or getting into mental health at a deeper level would be for me, but perhaps it could be. And so that improvement is something we're really energized by. And so we're taking this model and we're starting to work with companies like Flatiron Health, and soon to be a few other companies that I won't name until they're final, but really helping their workforce figure out a tactic and a mechanism to improve the burnout that happens when people don't feel like they belong. So the reason we titled this talk Belonging and Burnout is because there is a relationship between them. And to touch on that to a little bit of a deeper extent, I'll pass the metaphorical mic over to Dr. Leighna Harrison. So she'll touch a little bit about that. Go ahead, Doc.
Thanks, Tarun. So we can't talk about belonging and burnout without talking about identity. As Tarun mentioned, this is one of our sessions, and we use a model called the addressing model. It was created by clinical psychologist Pamela Hayes, where addressing is an acronym where each letter stands for a different aspect of identity. So you'll see going down the middle column, A is for age, D is for developmental disability, the next D is for acquired disability, and so on. In the middle column under power, we list who in the United States and Canada has historically held power based on that aspect of identity. And we understand power to be access to control over resources. These resources can include things related to the educational system, the healthcare system, the legislative system, the housing system, and so on. And then in the third column, we have groups that have historically held less power in those aspects of identity. So we're gonna take you through, I'll use myself as a model, what participants would be getting in this session. And so, yeah, Tarun, I'll have you go to the next slide. So if I were to do this for myself, yeah, that one, thanks. If I were to do this for myself, I would go through and I would cross out all the things that don't apply to me. And I would be left with, next slide, I would be left with this. So I have a lot of identities that align with the groups of people who have historically held power and privilege in our society. One point I did want to make is that some of these categories can change over time. So there was a time where I was in the less power category based on age. There may be a time in my life where perhaps I do acquire a disability and I may move into the less power section in terms of that. So some of these are fixed, like ethnicity or race. Some of them can change. And so it's important to know that this is a dynamic tool, that it's not always fixed. But we can't just look at this and say, well, I have power in these areas and I don't have power in the less power areas. And that brings us to the idea of intersectionality. So Professor Jackson touched on this earlier, that, we have to think about the interactions between systems of power and how they play out in our lives. Next slide. So intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. She is a Black attorney. She coined the term when she was a young law student at UCLA, when she was looking at labor statistics and who was represented in the workforce, and really identifying that the ways that the current research at the time was looking at these labor statistics were leaving out certain groups of people based on their intersecting identities. So if we were to look at my intersecting identities, and this is a model that I created while I was on my postdoc, I would first take all the things in the identities with social power column, and I would put them in this arrow. So you see everything here. One thing that I did add is height. And one thing that the addressing model misses is they don't talk about body image, type, or size. And I think that that is one thing that we also need to consider when we think about who historically has had power in this country and who hasn't. Then I would go and I would pull on the columns with less power, and I would put that in the next arrow. Next slide. So now I'm here. But I also have to dig into the identities with less social power a little bit more. Next slide. And I have to be very clear about the ways in which I do hold power and privilege, even within those identities with less social power. So yes, I do identify as a Black woman, and I'm mixed race, so I'm lighter skinned. That gives me a certain level of power and privilege in a society that promotes whiteness as the norm, and in which white people have historically held more power. I also use the term white adjacent. Some people, this term doesn't jive with them. For me, it does. I have a white mom. I was socialized in many white spaces. And so my proximity to that whiteness is also kind of this like invisible check that I've always got in my backpack that I can pull out and sign on when I need to. And then the Black minority identity. So a lot of the research around issues of race and oppression look at Black populations at the expense of other racial groups. On one hand, Black people have experienced significant oppression in this nation, which some of the earlier speakers have alluded to, for generations. And so it makes sense that we would be looking at Black populations. And when we think about other groups of people, such as Native Americans, who have also experienced, very, very intense oppression, segregation, and violence and genocide. And we don't often see the same levels of research attributed to those groups. So I do see that there's a little bit of privilege in that as well. And then finally, we have power earned. So I do have my doctorate. I speak Spanish and Portuguese as second and third languages. And I worked really hard for those things, right? So no one's going to take away my efforts. And a lot of the things in the identities with social power and even the social power within my less powerful identities, they supported those efforts, right? So I had parents who could help me through school. When I wanted to go, on these study abroad things and learn languages, they were able to help me. So it's never either or, it's a both and. Next slide. So you may be wondering, what does all of this have to do with burnout and belonging? Well, when we live in societies where those with power resemble those in that middle column, when we go to work in workplaces where those with power reflect those same identities in the middle column, this can be incredibly stressful. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the stress cycle. So we're going along, we're in equilibrium. This is kind of the status quo. Everything's okay. Next. Then something happens. Our alarm bells start going off. So this could be in the form of a microaggression at work. This could be, just being tired of being the only brown face in the room, whatever it is. And when that happens, there's a slight dip as we kind of react to whatever the alarm is, and then we start ramping up and we go into resistance. So we're pulling on all of our resources, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, to manage this threat. And then, next slide, we crash. So we're exhausted. The human body is designed to go through this phase. There's nothing wrong with this stress cycle. This is how we're designed to manage things in our environments that aren't good for us. However, the problem is that many of us never get to go to the resolution phase, and we're stuck in resistance. And this is when burnout happens. Next slide. So when we get burned out at work, we are having these constant feelings of depletion and exhaustion. We're feeling very distanced and negative and cynical towards our jobs. And there's reduced effectiveness. So we're putting in the same amount of effort, but we're getting less return. And so what we want to do as part of Mandala is think about how can you identify the relationship between your identity, your intersecting identities, the picture of your workplace, with how stress and burnout may be related to the level of belonging that you feel at work based on those identities. Next slide. So we really support people in managing that burnout. So this is adapted from Nagoski and Nagoski, Emily and Amelia Nagoski. They wrote a book a few years ago about burnout. And these are some ways to complete the stress cycle so that you're not hanging around in resistance, that you're able to come to exhaustion and completion, and you're able to do that as many times as you need to. So you can see that there's a number of things on here. And what I'd like to highlight is that Mandala, in and of itself, does a lot of these without even trying, right? So your crew, we're creating community. Laughter, we really value and love humor and sense of humor. And we identify humor as a way that many communities of color have survived just atrocious experiences. Crying, tears are welcome. There are healing properties in tears. And then creative expression. So we do a lot of writing exercises, imaginative exercises. We use a lot of metaphor. So just showing up to a Mandala session can help with some of these things. We also focus a lot on breathing and meditation. And so now I'm just going to check the time. Yeah, so now we're going to take a few minutes, and we'll invite you all to experience one of the things on here, which is breathing. And the reason we chose that one is because breath is something that you always have access to from the moment you're born until the moment that you die. It is a rhythmic reminder that we are here in the present moment. Many of us can get caught up in a painful past, thinking about this horrible thing that happened to us yesterday, last month, last year when we were kids. Or we're in an anxious future, wondering what's going to happen to me tomorrow, next month, next year, when I have kids, or whatever the scenario is. And so we miss out on the present moment. And the present moment is so vital because it's the only thing we ever really have. And our breath is one way to anchor us into the present moment. So wherever you are, if it's comfortable for you, I'll invite you to find yourself in a seated position, if you're able. You can close your eyes if you'd like. If that's not comfortable, just softly rest your gaze on something in the room in front of you. And start by taking in a nice, slow, deep breath in through the nose, down into the belly, and exhale. Inhaling and exhaling. You might start to notice the point where the air becomes breath on the inhale, and the point where the breath becomes air on the exhale. Perhaps you start to notice what it's like to just be breathing in this moment. You might start to feel yourself sink deeper and deeper into the surface that you're sitting on. Noticing the support coming up to meet you. The support of the chair, the floor beneath it, the ground beneath it, and the earth beneath it. These constant sources of support and foundation, holding you up and keeping you grounded. Now you might turn inward to your internal landscape. Starting to skim over what's inside of you, what's alive for you in this moment. In the same way a bird might skim over a body of water, close, but not touching. Perhaps you start to become aware of any feelings, any emotions that you're experiencing in this moment. You might see if these are associated with any physical sensations, tension or pain, or perhaps a feeling of looseness and relaxation. You might become aware of your thoughts, whatever content your mind is generating in this moment. And then you might see what your urges are. What do you feel like doing? What does your body feel like doing right now? So taken together, your feelings, physical sensations, thoughts, and urges. These are all the anatomy of your emotions. These are the things that your emotions are comprised of. And you might just notice what it's like to have this inner knowledge, this inner knowing. Now you might bring your attention back to your breath, noticing how your breath has changed or how it hasn't changed over the course of the past few minutes. Noticing the weight of your body on the surface that you're sitting on. Noticing the support that you always receive. And then taking a few more slow, deep breaths on your own. Maybe these are the deepest breaths you've taken all day. Noticing what it feels like to be anchored to this moment. And continuing to breathe on your own for a beat or two. And whenever you're ready, you can slowly open your eyes and or bring your attention back to the virtual space. So I'll just pause for a moment. I know I can't see all of you, but whenever I'm doing this with people I can see, it sometimes takes a moment for people to come back. And I'll just leave you with noticings. So a lot of the time people think, oh, I have to breathe right, I have to meditate right, I'm not doing it right. The only bad meditation is one that doesn't happen. So the idea is that we sit here with ourselves and all we do is notice and observe. And in our very busy lives of do, fix, grow, this is a nice moment where we can just be with and for ourselves. So if there are any thoughts or reactions or questions about the meditation, or feel free to drop them in the chat. And I will pass back to Tarun because I think we're moving into the general Q&A right now as well. Oh, thanks, Hannah. Glad you liked it.
Yeah, I just want to say that was like, even for me, I've just, even after knowing you and being with you, it felt like such a heavenly experience to go through that. My body was tense and I didn't even realize it. So thank you. I echo Hannah's appreciation. Thank you.
Yeah, you are so welcome.
Thank you.
So
yeah, Q&A. Yeah, I was gonna say, for the attendees that are live, if this brings us towards the near end of our summit, and I do want to say before we close it, let's make space for questions, either about any of the topics we covered during our session or the sessions that came before us. If you have anything that you'd like to even share, I can actually turn your audio on, and I would love to hear from people who've been with us the whole day on learnings or questions or thoughts they had, again, either about the Mandala content that we discovered or about the summit at large. So if people want to share, we would love to hear from them. Just raise your hand or put it in the Zoom chat and we'll call on you. While we do that, I would like to send a small feedback form, which for us is important, not just because we want to know what we did well, what we could do better, but also for those of you that want to stay in touch. I know that a lot of you learned a thing or two from the speakers. Being a part of our Slack community is one way of doing that, but also, if you don't mind, our way of collecting information is honestly just to get a form in. So if you have a few minutes now at the end of your day, just to write some thoughts down for us, we would really, really appreciate it. But thank you, Danya, for joining us. Thank you, Hannah. Again, space is open for any questions or comments.